Author of 7 books, the editor of several collections and many articles and reviews, his career bridges academia and multiple other worlds. His work has appeared in publications that include The Guardian, New Humanist, Prospect Magazine, Haaretz, The Forward, New Statesman, and many more. His most recent book is Strange Hate, Anti-Semitism, Racism, and the Limits of Diversity, published in 2019. November 2021 will see the publication of The Babel Message, a love letter to language, while his book, What Does a Jew Look Like?, the subject of today's talk, is now expected to be published next year. Keith, I am glad to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Alan. First of all, to say, if I occasionally look up, it's because I have 2 screens. So sometimes I put the Zoom thing on the top screen and I'm putting my presentation on the bottom screen. So when I'm looking at my presentation, it's like I'm looking in the camera. I am going to share my screen in a minute because I have a presentation. But what this talk is about is kind of almost like a preview of a book that will be coming out next year that draws on an interest or maybe even an obsession that I've had for a number of years. And I'll tell you about that now. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. You all see that?
Yeah.
So wait a sec, I need to find the way to share. There we go. Does that look good to everyone?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So the name of this project is What Does a Jew Look Like? And this is the starting point. In the last, some point in the last 10 years, I started noticing something in media coverage of Jews. And let's face it, there's been quite a lot of it in recent years, particularly since 2015. We've been visible in the media as almost as never before. And I started noticing that whenever there was a story about Jews online, and most newspapers or magazines put pretty much everything they do online, albeit sometimes behind a paywall, they had something in common. And that was, if you haven't guessed it already, that stories about Jews tend to be illustrated with pictures of a particular kind of Jew. And that is the black-hatted, bearded, long-coated Haredi, or strictly Orthodox or Jew. And it would tended to be men as well, that it was Haredi men. And also, the other thing that you'll see, and this is a fairly representative sample, is that it was often pictures of Haredi men taken from the back. And it's one of those things that once you realize what you're seeing, you start seeing it everywhere. And I started seeing this even in articles that didn't actually have very much to do with Haredi Jews, or that were about Jews in this country generally, not just Haredi Jews. So for example, so all these ones that I've chosen for this particular slide, they're all stories about rises in anti-Semitic incidents. And of course, whilst it's true that Haredi Jews often suffer disproportionately from that because they're very visible, anti-Semitism affects all Jews, including secular Jews, including Jews who do not look like this. And also, let's face it as well, Haredi women, not just Haredi men. And in fact, sometimes I would see pictures like this used to illustrate stories that could be about almost any Jew other than a Haredi Jew. So for example, some of you may remember a few years ago, there was a controversy about anti-Semitism in the Labour Club at Oxford University. And the Times did a story on it. And that was illustrated with a picture like this of Haredi Jews. Now, only tiny numbers of Haredi Jews go to university. And I think many Haredi Jews would be fairly horrified to see an image of them associated with somewhere like Oxford University. So I suppose in some ways I found this quite funny. I mean, I'll talk about the significance of this a little bit later. But as I'm going to argue, I don't think this is necessarily due to anti-Semitism. And so it was just something that I started noticing, and I started finding it amusing to collect, to sort of quote unquote collect stories about Jews in Britain that were illustrated with pictures of Haredi Jews. And eventually, friends used to forward me things, pictures like this, and they would say, "Here, Keith, here's another one for your collection." And I collated this on a blog that I called "All Jews Wear Black Hats and Have Beards," which, needless to say, was slightly sarcastic. As I put, if you can read it there, saying this is not an attack on Haredi Jews. It was just pointing out an interesting phenomenon. Personally, I don't mind being associated with Haredi Jews. I'm not Haredi. There are elements of the Haredi lifestyle that are antithetical to my own, but they're Jews and I'm a Jew. So I do feel some kind of connection to them. So I don't mind necessarily being associated with Jews like that, but it is inaccurate. Of course, there's also the irony that I have a very long black beard, and generally people who know me, although I'm not wearing it today, I usually wear black, and I actually quite like hats. In fact, I've got a hat that's a bit like the hat in the picture. But the point is pointing out this phenomenon of stories about Jews illustrated with stock photos of Haredi Jews. Now, over time, I started noticing something else. And that was that these pictures weren't just pictures of Haredi Jews. They were often pictures of the same Haredi Jews. Some of you may have seen, in fact, if you're online at all, or even not online, you are likely to have seen this particular picture of two Haredi men, one of them older than the other, walking along the street. Now, this is a picture that has been used certainly dozens, probably hundreds of times. It's also been used, by the way, by the Jewish Chronicle, but it's been used multiple times by The Guardian, by all sorts of publications, mostly in Britain, but also internationally as well. So I became fascinated by this particular picture. And again, people would forward it to me and say, "Hey, Keith, here are our old friends again." And I became fascinated by it from a number of perspectives. First of all, about what it says about the way non-Jews and even Jews see what the image of a Jew is. What is the generic Jew? What picture stands in for all Jews and all Jewish issues in this country and everywhere? And it appears to be, it's often the black-hatted, bearded, black-coated Jew, Haredi Jew. So it interested me from that perspective. It also interested me because of its significance in the media as a whole. And I'm someone who's written fairly and been published fairly broadly. And one thing that struck me that seems to have happened in the last few years without anybody realizing it is that there used to be a time when, if you look at newspapers 15, 20, 30 plus years ago, only a minority of stories would be illustrated, right? In fact, if you look at a newspaper today, it's not every story is illustrated. However, when stories are put online, it's de rigueur to illustrate them. it's very rare in any of the major newspapers in this country, and even some of the less major ones, for a newspaper to put up one of their stories online without illustrating it. At the same time, profits of newspapers and the media generally have been squeezed. In fact, a lot of local newspapers have closed. And that means that there's more and more pressure on editors, often junior editors, to find to illustrate more pictures than they would have done in the same position in the past. And at the same time, there's also pressure to get stuff up there fast. So it's kind of understandable that the people who do this at newspapers are generally known as sub-editors, will scrabble around for the most obviously Jewish picture they can find and that they can get quickly. And how do they do that? Well, they use things called photo libraries. And photo libraries are a newspaper or a magazine or a publisher sometimes will subscribe to them, and then they can have unlimited use of the photos in that library. And the people who run the photo library will try and populate it with pictures that can be used in all sorts of occasions. So I kind of got what was happening here, is that people were putting the word Jew or Jewish into a photo library search engine, and this was what was coming out. Or at least this, and this was even more interesting, this probably wasn't the only one, yet this one was the one that seemed to signify most strongly as Jewish. So after a while, I started to think, well, let's look at this picture itself. Let's try and add some context to it. Because one of the things I find uncomfortable about this, and as I say, I don't think it's anti-Semitism, or at least not anti-Semitism in a simple way. But it is certainly uncomfortable. One of the things that's uncomfortable about it is that it kind of erases the humanity of whoever these two people in the picture are. It turns them from two Haredi men into two generic Jews who stand in for the whole. So I wanted to kind of, if you like, put the humanity back into these two people. So, and it wasn't difficult to do. All I had to do was to click on the photo when I found it in a search, when I found it on a newspaper site, and let's face it, there were plenty to choose from, and to look at what the credits were. And this is the credits. Photograph by Rob Stoddard for Getty Images. Now, Getty Images is an enormous, very commonly used photo archive, photo library that many many newspapers subscribe to, and you could use it yourself. You can, if you wanted to illustrate this talk when you put it online, Alan, you could download this picture from it for a fee, right? Because you're not going to subscribe to it, you can download it as a one-off thing and to get a license for it. So the Getty Images thing made sense. But I wanted to know, who was this guy, Rob Stoddard? And again, that was very, this isn't much of a detective story. I just Googled him, and fortunately, his name is not John Smith. If his name was John Smith, there'd be a problem because there are a lot of John Smiths, so it's difficult to track them down on Google. But there are not many Rob Stoddards. In fact, there may only be one. And I Googled him and I got to his website. And this is his website. And he's a portrait photographer. He does photojournalism, but he particularly likes doing portraits. And this is the one he has on his front page of his website, which is from a series he did, which I think is actually quite wonderful. I think it's a fascinating photo. And if you have a look at his website, you'll see he's done some really, really good stuff. And so the next stage was to get into contact with him. And again, that was easy. I emailed him, said who I was, and said I was trying to find something more about this picture, again, my phone number, and he rang me back within half an hour, I think it was. Very easy. And we got chatting. And I found out a bit more about him. he had been a full-time newspaper photographer. In fact, one of the things he did is he covered the Arab Spring in Egypt about, when was that, about 10 years ago. So he'd been there, bought the t-shirt, but he'd got a bit burnt out. He got a bit fed up with the constant grind of being a newspaper photographer. And he was actually now a maths teacher, although he does portraiture on the side, not so much for money, but because of art, because he likes the art form. But it was quite interesting to hear from him one of the reasons why he got a little bit, I wouldn't say disillusioned, but got a bit fed up with his previous job. And one of them was because of the photo library thing. He had noticed, by the way, that his photographs had been reused and reused and reused and reused. And he himself was starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable about it. He was aware of the issues. He was aware of the issues of making Jews look generic, of singling out Haredi Jews, or of treating them as sort of exotic figures. And so the obvious question to that is, well, why did you sell your picture to the photo library? Well, actually, he was commissioned by Getty Images to get some photographs to illustrate a specific story that was about Haredi Jews. And this is what the story was. This was in 2015. If you remember, I think it was either at the end of December 2014 or the beginning of January 2015, there were the attacks in Copenhagen and in France. And one of the responses to that in the UK was, as the story suggests, that British police stepped up patrols in Stamford Hill. So he was told, go and get some pictures of Jews in Stamford Hill, which he did. And they were put on the archive, but they became not about Jews in Stamford Hill, although they have occasionally been used for that. They became about Jews with a big J, about all Jews. And he was a bit uncomfortable about that. On the other hand, it was also true that Rob wasn't very knowledgeable about the Jewish community, because it turned out, and you could probably work this out from this particular picture, that the pictures were actually taken on Shabbat. Now, they weren't taken on Shabbat in Jerusalem, or Bnei Barak or somewhere like that, because if they were, then he would have got a hostile reception. But he says they just ignored him. He really wasn't aware. And why should he be? Because he's an English guy with no particular contact or previous experience with Jews. He didn't really realize that could be seen as inappropriate. I mean, he understood the issues about exoticizing Jews and the problems with that in a general way, but he didn't understand the specific things about what Shabbat is and why taking photos on Shabbat might be a problem. He told me, going back to the famous picture of the two gentlemen walking away from him, he actually pointed out, and I'm not going to say exactly where it is, he actually told me when and where it was taken. It was actually taken on the A10, basically in going through Stamford Hill. He basically went there and he took pictures of two Haredi men. And apparently they said hello to him. They said good morning to him. They were quite nice about it. But then Rob told me something that was really, really interesting and something I didn't know. He said to me, do you know that there are pictures of these two men taken from the front? And he was right. This is what they look like. And what was fascinating about this, and I checked this out using something called a Google reverse image search, where you upload an image to Google and it sees if that photo has been published anywhere else. These photos have never been used. So no editor for a British newspaper has illustrated a picture of Jews using has never chosen these to illustrate a story about Jews. It seems to me, it seems that the picture of the Jews taken from the back is the one that some editors prefer. Now, to give a generous interpretation of that, that may be to do with some probably vague and unfocused sense that it's inappropriate to show people's faces in this culture. So it may be, who knows, that maybe some editors think, I know that there are some old wives' tales going around about how Orthodox Jews feel that if you take a picture of them, it will take their soul, which is not true. They do not think that. But it is certainly true that many Haredi Jews are concerned for modesty and would not want to be taken from the front. So they may have kind of got it right, but for perhaps the wrong reason. So that's a good reason not to show people's faces. But there's perhaps also a bad reason as well, which is the sense that Jews taken from the back seem dark and mysterious and other. So it's that mixture of good and bad reasons that, again, interests me here. So this picture told me some things I didn't know, and I started to think, what if I tried to track these people down? It could be a father and a son. I guess through looking at it, that the older guy, perhaps might be Sephardi or Mizrahi. He looked quite swarthy. And these are, by the way, on their own terms, actually, I think this picture on the left is a lovely picture, actually. It shows that Shabbat relaxed. They're probably walking to or from shul or to and from lunch. It's a lovely picture. Maybe that's one of the reasons it's never been used. So I thought, can I trace these people and find out what they think of this? And so I was very wary of the stereotype that, well, all Haredi people know each other. But as it turns out, I had a contact who works for Hamodia, which is the Haredi newspaper. And I'd been chatting to her about this issue and for a while. And I sent the picture and said, could you find out who these people are? And within 5 minutes, she had the name, at least of the older guy. She just showed it around the office. Oh, that's so-and-so. Somebody else in the office said. Now, I'm not going to tell you this person's name, because as it happens, I did contact him via this intermediary. And whilst he was not hostile or anything in any way, he didn't really want to go public about this, because I was writing an article about this, and I tried via another route as well, and someone told me he's a very modest man and he does not want the publicity. And I thought that's fair enough. And I didn't pursue the younger man who may or may not be his son either, because, you know, I didn't want to put this person into any kind of difficult position or anything like that. What I can say is, there's actually, I can tell you that he's, there's a picture of him on YouTube. There's a video of him on YouTube. And here he is singing a song online. And I'm not going to show it or tell you where to find it, but it is on YouTube if you Google, if you actually knew his name. Just singing a Hasidic song with someone that somebody put online, which, by the way, gives the line that no Haredi people use the internet. Of course, many Haredi people use the internet. And so I thought, fine, I'm not going to push this anymore. I don't want to be too intrusive. I did hear, again via an intermediary, that he had noticed this and that he'd been the subject of some fairly mild teasing because of it, because even from the back, people who knew this guy could identify who it actually was. So that was the story of how I discovered this. Anyway, So I started chatting to Rob a bit more about this. And we started talking about something that is not one of the things that I'm experienced about, but I've subsequently become more interested in, which is the issue of photography and visual representation of Jews in particular, and in the media in particular. How do you create pictures of Jews, and for what purpose? Because it's all very easy for me to say, you know, you're using these stock photos of Haredi Jews taken from the back, and, you know, that's not great. It's a bit intrusive, it's a bit lazy. It's all very well for me to say that. But on the other hand, to suggest an alternative to it is actually quite difficult, because so many stories need to be uploaded very, very fast these days and illustrated fast, that only a fraction of stories can be illustrated. The newspapers can only send out a photographer to illustrate a fraction of the stories that they publish. But there's a wider issue too about what says Jew. How do we want to be seen, and how do we want others to see us? So I started to work on a project with Rob. Oops. They decided to call "What Does a Jew Look Like?" And it's a project with a really very simple aim, which was to compile a book of portraits taken by Rob that would illustrate the different ways that Jews look. It would be both an artistic project, but it would also be an educational project. And we got a bit of funding for it, and it's going to come out next year. And part of the funding means that we can buy a certain number of copies, which we're going to send to newspaper editors, partly just to sort of start some debate and thinking about it. Now, the photos themselves are not necessarily photos that would be appropriate or right for a newspaper, because they're portraits, they're not photojournalism. But nonetheless, what we're trying to do is to try to represent the diversity of ways that British Jews are Jews, identify as Jews, and the ways that they look and represent themselves visually. Now, this isn't the first project. I'm going to show you some of the photos in a second, don't worry. This isn't the first project that has been done on photographs of Jews or of British Jews. A few years ago, there's a guy called Judah Passau who produced an exhibition, pictures of British Jews. That was photojournalism, and photojournalism is taking pictures of Jews in situ, doing Jewish or non-Jewish things. It's not portraits, although the distinction between the two isn't completely absolute. There was another exhibition, and it's just gone from, I'm having a senior moment and it's gone. I can't remember what it was called. It was in the Jewish Museum before lockdown, and it was called simply Jew. And the person who did this project took pictures of Jews around the world against an identical background. And sometimes it wasn't clear what made this person Jewish. And the photographer provided very limited information. It would just say the name and the profession. So John Butcher, something like that. We decided, Rob and I, to do the opposite approach. We decided to take portraits whose context told us a story about the person in them. And we also decided in the book to include the words. So I've done, the way it's worked is that I have collaborated with Rob. I have, as the person who knows the Jewish community, found people for him to photograph. He's done the portrait session. I've come along to a few, but mostly it's just the two of them. And it works very well because Rob doesn't have an agenda other than to produce a great portrait. He isn't trying to come to this without any particular perspective about what Jews should be and what they look like. So he's and neutral figures like that can be really useful. The other thing I do is that after each portrait session, I do a short interview with everyone in it, and where we talk about who they are Jewishly. And so the way the book is going to work is that on one hand of the page there's going to be the portrait, and on the other side of the page it's going to be the person in it in their own words. So this is one of them. This is Tila, and she is an artist. And she worked, because she's an artist, she's quite visually aware, and she worked with Rob to create a picture that was in the bit of a flat that she uses as a studio, but also included Jewish elements in it. You could see also that she wears a long skirt and her head is covered. And she is at the sort of feminist end of modern orthodoxy, and and she talks about herself in that sort of way. And again, this is a sort of image of Jews that we don't often get in the media, is a Jew who is Orthodox but not Haredi, and who is Orthodox but is feminist Orthodox. Again, that is something that is becoming increasingly a thing in the British Jewish community, but outside the Jewish community, it isn't really very well known. This is possibly my favorite one in the book. I'm not sure. This is Yecheskel. Some of you might know him. He's a United Synagogue rabbi in Kingston. And he's an extraordinary person in that he's Swiss. And whilst he's halachically Jewish, he's not a convert. He was raised in a very unusual background, and he wasn't raised Jewish. And he would describe himself as Haredi, but he's Haredi in a very interesting and complicated sort of way, in a way that I find fascinating. And the picture of him is, for one thing, I love the fact that, yes, if you look at his headshot, you think, oh, yes, Orthodox Jew. But look below him, he's wearing this sort of tweed, almost like the sort of thing that gentlemen mountaineers wore in the Victorian era to go and conquer the Eiger or Matterhorn or whatever it was. And the desk on which he's got a volume of Talmud there, this is the desk on which he studies, is he made himself from words near his parents' house in Switzerland. The portrait at the back is an Orthodox Jewish sage. I have to tell you, I've forgotten who it is. So again, I love this picture because when you first look at it, you think it's one thing, and then it draws you in, and you start seeing the complexities of the person, and you realize this is not a generic Jew. This is Yecheskel, Rabbi Yecheskel. I also love this one. Some of you may recognize him because he's an actor and a comedian. He's a guy called Paul Kay. He lives in Finchley. He's been in a lot of stuff. And one of the things I like about this picture is its denseness, right? His house is full of interesting clutter. And it's just so visually rich. And the pose of him, which is sort of slightly hunched as well, suggests that kind of complexity. And his words, which I'm not going to show you now because you'll have to wait to the book, talk about the complexities of his Jewish identity, which is very strong, and how that plays out as someone who is in the entertainment industry. This is one that I'm quite proud of because it took quite a bit of time to arrange. You can't see his face because he didn't want his face to be fully shown, but he is actually a prisoner. We worked with a prison chaplain in a prison in Surrey, who I met completely by chance, and I talked about this project, so it'd be great to have a Jewish prisoner. And Rob, I actually went with Rob on this one. And his history is not the conventional Jewish North London history. He's not from North London, for one thing. His upbringing, he's also mixed race. But he's part of this wonderful chaplain that I met, has this little group of Jews at this prison we got to spend some time with, and they all had fascinating stories. But also it also taught me, I'm not sure I needed to know it, but it was good to be reminded that we are many things as a community, and that we are prisoners too. And some of us are not suburban Northwest London Jews. But as well as having people who are a little bit quirky on the outside, we also have people who are pillars of the communal establishment. You might know this gentleman. This is Adrian Cohen, who is active in about 1 million different things, including the Jewish Labour Movement, in the London Jewish Forum, a lot of other stuff. And Rob asked him, where did you want to have your picture taken? And he said he wanted it in his shul, because this is, by the way, pre-COVID, this one was taken. And actually, I should have said about that, we had basically about 18 months where we could do nothing for this project. So there are some people, for example, there's a 17-year-old woman in this book who is now a 19 or 20-year-old woman. But, you know, that's the pandemic for you. And what I like about this one is, in a way, it's different from the others in that it's straightforward. But it's straightforward in a way that, I'm not going to use those terms in the book, Hamisher. There's something about this that's Hamisher. He looks completely relaxed. He looks completely in his element. And yes, he's dressing up a bit by wearing, the photo I think was done in late afternoon and he's wearing tefillin. But, you know, he wanted to wear tefillin. We didn't tell him, Rob didn't say to him, hey, wear tefillin. You'll look more Jewish that way. It was his decision to do it. And again, this sort of image that is completely ordinary in the Jewish community, but again, we don't see it in the British media, of a modern Orthodox Jew who is not a Haredi Jew, who's completely engaged in the world. He's a solicitor for a law firm, and yet he has this part of his life where his synagogue and prayer and all that sort of thing is extremely important to him. So we didn't shy away from deliberately Jewish trappings, but we didn't push it either. We didn't say, hey, look more Jewy, because some people, they didn't want to seem that way. And here's an example of that. That is, this is a guy called Rio, who's a punk musician, but with actually a really interesting Jewish story, quite unconventional, but very interesting Jewish story. Again, I love this one. I like the intensity. And the uncompromising nature of it, but we didn't say to him, say something that looks Jewish, but actually he wanted to be photographed in a place that was important to him, and so he had his photo done, his portrait done on stage when he was just before the doors opened at the pub where he was playing a gig. So I like that one a lot. This is, I refer to the 17-year-old woman who is no longer a 17-year-old woman, and this is she. She is also comes from a mixed African and Russian background, and so we were very keen. That was something we were very keen to have in the book, is Jews from a mixture of backgrounds. So we have Mizrahi Jews and Sephardi Jews and so on. Without trying not to be tokenistic as well. One of the reasons I like this as well is she's wearing her LJY Netzer youth movement shirt. Again, something you don't normally see in images of British Jews, something that is very normal, but not usually visible. This is the final one I'm going to show, because it illustrates, some of you may know who this is, but I'm not going to say who she is. one of the best things about this whole thing is that I chose people. I didn't choose people just to plug a particular demographic hole. Oh, we need a woman who's 45 years old and is Orthodox or something like that. But on the other hand, I also wanted to see that certain bases were covered. And I wanted to include somebody who was a Zionist activist on the right or even far right of the spectrum, and that's this particular person. But when she had her portrait done, and when she sent me her words that we're going to include in the book, she didn't mention that. What she mentioned was her commitment to teaching and being a practitioner of yoga. And this I thought was brilliant because it was a reminder that the way that Jews are seen as from the outset, the thing that the outside world sees as the defining thing about who a Jew is or what they look like may not be the way that a Jewish individual sees it. They may define themselves in different terms. And it was really important for me to have that reminder. So that's a taste of the book. It will be out next year. We've included less pictures than we wanted to because we had this massive 18-month time where we couldn't do anything. And we thought, well, we can either continue for another 2 years or we can get this book finished. What I think it does is it provides a bit of a taster to both Jews and non-Jews of the sometimes infuriating, sometimes fantastic, sometimes baffling diversity of British Jews. And whilst we're not offering pictures for editors to use instead of Haredi Jews, I think what we are saying, in a hopefully not too subtle way, is work harder. Work harder to find images of Jews that speak to the plurality of Jewish identity and to the marvelous diversity of who we are. Because Rob and I worked hard to try and find lots of different kinds of Jews. And we weren't paid to do this. We did this out of love for the project. But if you're being paid to do this by a newspaper, then what's your excuse? So there we are. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Keith, for very absorbing and thought-provoking talk. And yes, I encourage, so far we've got one person who's put a question in chat. There may be, and I hope there are quite a few others. So I'll start with Simon, if you could unmute yourself and address yourself to Keith.
Okay. Can you hear me, Todd?
Yeah.
Hear you, yes.
All right.
Can, yes.
One quick point and one quick question. My daughter's a rabbi in America. They have about 300 people in the Chayda. And they also have a couple of people come every year, quite young, late teenagers or early 20s, from Israel. And the class was asked, what does an Israeli look like? And this is the Jewish class. And the answer was the black hat Haredi that you described at the beginning. None of them said the people standing in front of me who just looked like anybody else that age from America. They didn't recognize them as Israeli in their mind. So there is a sort of blockage there. That was just a bit of information. My question is, going back to your project, I understand it, but I want to ask a question. How do the papers represent a story about a Protestant or a Catholic? Why do we need a picture?
I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the reasons is the reason I earlier, which is just that everything needs a picture nowadays. That every newspaper, they don't necessarily put it in the newspaper itself, but they put it online. How that happened, I'm not sure, but I think it has a lot to do with grabbing people's eyeballs, and particularly enabling sharing on social media. If you have a striking photo, or what the editor sees as a striking photo, then it gets more clicks. So I think it's partly to do with that. But I have to say, I haven't done a comparative study about other groups. Now, I have talked to Rob about this a lot, and he says the situation with regard to Haredi Jews is quite similar to that with British Muslims. When editors look around for a picture, a generic picture of British Muslims, it tends to be the most from British Muslims, the ones that are wearing the long robes, and often men with long beards, in fact. Also shying away from women, partly out of respect, partly out of maybe misconstrued ideas of what's culturally appropriate or not. So the situation is certainly similar with that. Whether it's the case with stories about Protestants or Catholics, I'm not sure. But the point is that we don't tend to have stories about Protestants. We tend to have stories about the Church of England, or maybe a story about Methodists. And it's easier to illustrate those stories because you can just find something from a religious building, from a church, or you can have a picture of bishops going into the synod in Canterbury or something like that. Again, Catholics, kind of similar there as well. But it's certainly true that there is an unspoken idea, and this is where your first story was interesting to me. Even amongst Jews who are not Haredi, that the most religious people are the most authentic. Now, I say this as a Reformed Jew. I think we are often working with many Reformed Jews, even maybe sometimes myself, although I try not to, are sometimes working with an idea of Jewish authenticity in which we are kind of running to play catch up. And the idea that authenticity has to be seen is an interesting one, and it needs to be unpicked. I'm not sure where it comes from. Sometimes, and this is part of the job of sociologists, although I think I've only begun to really think about this in the last few years, is to understand why some taken for granted assumption, to interrogate taken for granted assumptions. So the taken for granted assumption that your personal religious authenticity is expressed in how you look, how you dress, and how you seem. That's an obvious assumption, but it comes from somewhere. It has a history. It needs to be dug into. I haven't done that work yet, but I hope to do so in due course.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
No. Thank you very much indeed. Good. So, are there any more questions?
Well,
while we're perhaps waiting for another question, I was going to put something to you, Kate, literally just based on what you've said. And I just, it's kind of more speculation, but do you think that perhaps the reason why people do make the assumption you've just alluded to is that they have a kind of rather mistaken voluntarist way of looking at Jews, as in, if you're a Jew, you are someone who has chosen to simply adopt a belief, and rather than seeing us as diverse and part of a nation where belief is one aspect of who we are, that they've got this voluntarist conception of Jews, which I know some people they subscribe to that view, which is why, for example, they'll sort of say, well, it's so mysterious to have a Jewish state. How can you have a state based purely on a religion? So is that maybe part of the mistake that people might be making?
Really glad you raised that, Jeremy. So I was invited to make a submission to there's an all-party parliamentary group on religion and the media, which did a major inquiry this year on how religion is represented in the media. And if you Google that, the all-parliamentary group, you can read the report. It's quite interesting reading, and they drew extensively on what I'd done project and my submission to it in that, and I spoke at the project's launch. One thing that came across very, very clearly, and I tried to push this very strongly, but I wasn't the only contributor who did, is even though this was the all-party parliamentary group on religion and media, is that the concept of religion is a real problem, right? It applies very well to Protestants, where faith is central, and it has a highly voluntaristic conception of what it is to be a Christian. It applies less well to Catholics and Orthodox Christians, but it applies very poorly to Jews, and it applies very poorly to Muslims as well. It even applies quite poorly to African Christians as well, because for many minorities in Britain are what I would call ethno-religious minorities. We are both ethnicities and we are both religions. We are a mixture of those. We didn't create the concept of religion. It's not a Jewish concept. It's a concept in modern Ivrit. We use the word dat for it, which is not very satisfactory, really. And it's not an ancient term. There's often a sense of, I think, sometimes incomprehension here, is that many people, and this can slide into anti-Semitism, but it's usually just ignorance. The idea that Jews are a faith, and therefore, the more we believe and the more we express our belief and the more we show our belief, the more Jewish we are. And that's not the case, probably for the majority of British Jews, where it's a much more complicated thing. But often we're so used to the fact that it's an amalgam that we forget that other people don't understand that. So I think there is a real job of education to be done. And I said this in the inquiries thing. We need to educate people about that complex interplay between religion and ethnicity. We need to educate people about the complexities about what being a Jew is. And not just for the point of view of stopping anti-Semitism, because education doesn't always, stopping anti-Semitism isn't just a job of education, because racism isn't just about ignorance, although it sometimes is. One of the things I tried to do with this book is to make a modest contribution to that job of education, and to make what should, probably for everybody on this call, is an obvious point, that there are many different kinds of Jews. Just to make that point, because it's a point that needs to be made.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much for that.
Can I ask a question? I wanted to ask a question to you, and if we were face-to-face, if we were doing a face-to-face talk, I'd have asked this question and you could have, while I was doing the talk. Has anybody else here on this call, how many of you had noticed the famous picture of the two Jews before?
Me.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, not bad. 7, another one. Okay. So it's not just me then.
Can I say something?
Yes.
It was actually something very similar was pointed out in a talk a year or two ago. So I've noticed it since then. Maybe I hadn't before that.
I think as soon as you notice it,
Be aware of it.
The first time someone notices to you, you won't stop noticing it. I promise you. But I have to say though, that this whole project was born out of the Corbyn years when Jews were in the center of the media storm. And now that we're a little bit less close to the center of political discourse, there are less stories of Jews around. So we're not seeing it quite as much.
Can I say something as well, please?
Rosalind, I think, had a hand up.
It's actually Michael Daniels. While you were showing those shots, I was mindful of the photographs that used to appear in the press during the days of Nazi persecution of Jews, where there would be photographs of young children, ordinary dressed men and women, but always almost always in the background were one or two Orthodox Jews, even those who were painting lines in roads and all this sort of thing. So the object of that photo, press photography, was to put Jews into several classes. One was the religious one were the children, and one were the ordinary men and women. What do you say to that?
That's interesting, and that also but it works. I think it's a slightly different phenomenon to what we're talking about today. There's also, you're also talking about a time when photos were much more consciously constructed, partly because they couldn't be taken as quickly. And so they were much more composed than they are today. But also there's a related issue of the use of the image of the black-headed bearded Jew in anti-Semitic caricatures, which still certainly happened in the Nazi period, and it happens today. It even happens today in anti-Semitism in Muslim countries, where, and that is tied in with ignorance. It's not just ignorance, it's racism, but it also tied into ignorance, because one thing I have seen is that often some people, particularly in countries that have no Jews, have no idea that Jews don't all look like that. But in fairness to this particular picture, one of the things, taking it from the back, it doesn't amplify certain anti-Semitic stereotypes. So it doesn't amplify the nose in particular, or that there is a particular Jewish face. It's very paradoxical. I think the thing about choosing pictures of Jews taken from behind, as I said, it probably comes from some vague sense that to not reinforce anti-Semitic stereotypes, at the same time as also drawing on assumptions about who Jews are that can at least become anti-Semitic. So there's this odd duality here of respect and otherness that often characterizes the nature of majority-minority relations. Somebody put a question in the chat, which was...
I'm just going to, so it's from Shoshana Hoffman. Is she there? Would you like to unmute yourself? Shoshana?
Yes, I can.
There you are, yes.
I can't speak.
Oh,
I
can you
can't.
speak up just a little bit?
I can't.
You can't. Okay, that's fine. What I'll do is I'll ask the question for you, if I may, which is, how would you like newspaper editors to depict Jews? Is the question that Shoshana asked.
Thanks. It's a good question. In a word, I would like newspaper editors. When we say editors, by the way, we're talking about people way down the food chain. We're not talking about national editors. We're talking about the sub-editors, the people who are in the engine room of the paper. I would like them to represent Jews in different ways. I would like them to find different ways of doing it. And when they find an image that they like, I want them to question, saying, could I push myself a little bit further in finding something that's a bit more interesting? I think there's a big issue with using photo libraries because it makes newspapers lazy. I understand the need for them, but it does make them lazy. I would like there to be more commissioned photo sets. There's nothing to stop a national newspaper, even if they don't need it for immediate use, to say to one of their photographers or to a freelance photographer, go around within the next week, I want 24 pictures of different kinds of Jews in different settings, right? Going into a Reform synagogue, going into an Orthodox synagogue, going into JW3. And then you can use pictures of famous Jews. That's another thing you can do. There are lots of different ways you can do it. And you can also use pictures that actually directly illustrate the story, right? So you could, if there's a story about, when the CST every every year releases its pictures, its statistics rather, about rises in anti-Semitic incidents, use a picture that illustrates anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitic banner, an anti-Semitic demo, a CST security guard outside a synagogue. You know, all those things don't take too much thought to do. But I would say this as well. I am not a newspaper sub-editor. To some extent, it's up to them to do the hard work. And I was asked to meet with one of the press complaints bodies to talk about this. And that was one of the things I said, is that it shouldn't, Jews can advise, Jews can offer suggestions, but ultimately, it is not Jews' responsibility to get this right? Because it puts us on the back foot.
Very much for that. Ron Frensel, you have a question.
I think it's already been answered by Keith. I asked about famous Brits who were known academia people, such as Zbigniew Bauman, who could be, and I'm sure you know.
Yeah, it was great influence on my work. I actually happened to see him teach a couple of times. I kept trying to get him to Limud, but I never managed to get him there before he died, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it's too late.
Those work in certain issues. Famous Jews work in certain issues. So, certain cases, it wouldn't. A famous Jew like David Baddiel or Zygmunt Bauman or the chief rabbi wouldn't work in a story about a rise in the number of anti-Semitic incidents. It might work in a story about Jewish representation in academia. So, for example, some of the stories on campus anti-Semitism, and there have been a fair few in the last few years, could be illustrated by pictures of Jewish academics, or a Jewish, or even a building. The Jewish, I mean, it's not there anymore, but the Oxford Centre for Jewish and Hebrew and Jewish Studies. You know, and also I think I think one of the issues here is also that newspapers, they're in this brutal fight to the death over eyeballs and getting clicks. So they're going to go for the most obvious pictures. And I understand that, but there is also a case for saying, find an intriguing picture. So, for example, I don't know if anybody had ever visited the Oxford Centre for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. It's now in an ordinary building in the centre of Oxford. It was in this Elizabethan manor house, this gorgeous Elizabethan manor house in the village of Yarnton, just outside Oxford. Now, if you illustrate a story about anti-Semitism in the Oxford Labour Club with that picture, some people are going to say, wait, why is there a picture of an Elizabethan manor house there? Maybe that's another way of getting clicks, because people are going to actually think that this is striking, rather than a picture of the Sheldonian Library on the one hand, or a couple of Haredi Jews taken from the back on the other hand. You know, there's a value in things that are surprising, and I think that the brutality of the online fight for attention may be causing editors to be a little less brave.
Very much. We've got time for a last question. So Richard Brager, you've got your hand up. So over to you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm just curious, you mentioned one of the aims of your book being to educate at some level. I was just wondering if the scope of your work has gone beyond what you've been speaking about and has embraced other areas like Ethiopian Jews, Moroccan Jews, Indian Jews, and so on, and representing what do those Jews look like as part of the story.
We haven't included every slice of diversity in the Jewish community. We made it very clear in the introduction. This is not everything, right? Having said that, just before I came on here, we're doing the final few, Rob is doing the final few photos now, and he's going up to Scotland. We weren't able to do a trip to Scotland during lockdown, so he's rushing up to Scotland in a week. And the guy who we're photographing in Edinburgh said, I know a couple of Ethiopian Jews in Edinburgh. And Rob said, yes, let's do that. I was very careful to have Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews in there. Two of the people there are that I showed, the prisoner and also the young woman at the end, are both mixed race as well. It's not perfect. It's really, really not perfect. There is a lot of things and people that I would have liked to have had, don't have. But we realized we started off wanting to do 100 portraits, but these things take an age to set up. And it's expensive, so we had to be more modest than that, and we had to be modest about what we could include and we not include. We did include one Jew with a disability, again, but we're also aware of tokenism, and we don't want. Part of the point of allowing these people to control where they're photographed, what they're photographed with, and what they say about themselves, is to allow them to subvert the idea that they are a Mizrahi Jew and only a Mizrahi Jew, right? So that's actually quite important to me, to find a way to do that. And in that respect, the relatively small number of pictures we've got actually helps, because it's too small for anyone to think we're being representative. It's just a thing here. There's a wider question though about, we kind of need a book about this almost for every British minority, and we also need, I think we need a book about this. This is one thing I wanted to do at the start, but it became impossible. I wanted to include enough pictures of Haredi Jews to illustrate the fact that they don't all dress alike, and that there are minor differences in dress code amongst Haredi men and women that make real differences. So we could say that's how a Gera would dress, that's how belts would dress. In the end, it was too difficult to get the access. We do have a couple of pictures of Haredi Jews, but we didn't able to. But I would love at some point for somebody to do a visual guide to what different kinds of Haredi Jews look like. I'll leave you with this, is that we were 5 years ago, I was with my kids in the Vatican City. We went to Rome, and I was pointing out to my daughter, who I think was about 9 at the time, or 10 or something, the different nuns that we were seeing who were on pilgrimages to the Vatican. They didn't all dress the same, and that was, I used that to explain that there were different orders. And my daughter says she should write a book about that, and it could be, and I thought it could be like an I Spy guide, if you remember I Spy guides, where you've got a different order. And then I realized that would be completely inappropriate and totally wrong. And ditto with Haredi Jews. I would not want someone to go out and say, oh, look, that's a Gera over there. You know, so it's the sort of thing that when you think about it more, you realize that the minefield for doing this kind of educational work is, the minefields are enormous.
Very, very final question from Alan.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Keith, I'd like to ask you, with all the anti-Semitism, this question is being asked by my wife, who is hiding behind the virtual screen behind me. With all the anti-Semitism around at the moment, and stories that we hear of people removing their kippas because they think it's going to attract problems, do you have any problems with people refusing to have their photographs taken because it might put them in danger?
Sorry, you froze. Can you still hear me, people?
Yeah. Shall I repeat the question?
Can you still hear me? Yeah, no, I got your question. You just froze at the end. We didn't have many refusals. We did have quite a few occasions where logistics worked against us, and then the world locked down and it became impossible. But we did have a few people who sort of dropped off, probably, and that might have been due to that. Or, well, not due to fear in that respect, but due to concerns about being visible. And this was particularly the case with the more the Haredi leading end of Orthodoxy and some Haredi Jews as well. We found it very difficult. I mean, it's not difficult to talk to people in the Haredi community. There are plenty of people who will talk, and I have contacts. But to get people to have their picture taken, that takes a lot of negotiation. But that's not just about fear, though. That's also to do with a very, very strong culture of modesty, whereby it's not the done thing necessarily, particularly outside your community, to display yourself in that way. So I think that's probably more of an issue than anti-Semitism generally. And we don't really give identifiable details that people could be tracked down. And the one occasion where we did do that, that was the prisoner. We've disguised his name, and he's not shown face on. He's actually getting out later this year, which I'm really, really happy about. I'll send him a copy of the book. One thing and here's probably, there was one thing that I just could not find a way around, is I really wanted to include at least one picture of a Haredi Jewish woman. But I did have a few contacts that I sort of raised it, and they passed me on to other people, and it eventually became clear it wasn't going to happen. And I could have pushed. I could have spent months working on it, but in the end I felt I don't want to push. I don't want to push, because much as though I have issues with erasure of women from pictures in the Haredi community, they're being airbrushed out of pictures in the Haredi newspapers, the way that's going to change is not by a Jew like me saying, here, come be in my book, I want to take your picture. That's not how things change. And I also recognize that they're vulnerable by being visibly Jewish in society that has an anti-Semitism problem.
Okay, I understand that. Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to Jeremy to propose the vote of thanks. Jeremy.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, I want to thank you, Keith, for your really absorbing and highly thought-provoking talk on what does a Jew look like. I think what you've done is posed one of those very deeply provocative, mind-expanding questions akin to who is a Jew, but one that makes us reflect, question our assumptions, and sort of think outside the box. And I knew before the talk that Keith would do that and would stimulate us in that way, because a few years ago, the two of us had a fascinating debate in the hallowed chambers of JW3 about whether anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism. I think you may remember that. And he didn't disappoint us this evening any more than he did a few years ago. I think it was a really fascinating talk. What was clear is that you carried out some really amazing investigative work on that photograph of the two Haredi men, and kind of gave them a sense of humanity that I think had previously been absent. And I think what you've also done in the talk, which is so important, is you've illustrated the danger, and I think you use these words, of diversity denial, of thinking about Jews, as with any other people, on the basis of stock images, generalized assumptions, and common visual stereotypes. And as you said, there needn't be anything malign about it, but it is something that we do need to be very careful about. And I think that applies, as I say, to every community. I think your photographic project, your portrait project that you've talked about for so long, is a very important way of showcasing the diversity of British Jews and illustrating the many ways that Jews can be and should be represented visually. And I think it will help, perhaps, longer term, to sort of change attitudes. As you say, people need to work harder on something like this. So, and I also want to thank you finally for answering so many interesting and intelligent questions posed by our audience. And personally, I look forward very much to reading the book that you've co-authored, which I'm sure will be a really amazing read and very interesting indeed. So can I ask all those present, please, to show your gratitude to Keith by unmuting yourselves? Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to come to B'nai B'rith live or in person in the future.
Look forward to having you very much.
Thanks for your questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you very much, Keith.
Very much.
Bye.
My pleasure.
Where is the mouse?
Lee?
Ah, fascinating.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy and Alan, for organising this.
Pleasure.
See you soon. Good luck with the